There is a house 20 miles north of London where the red brick has weathered for more than 5 centuries, and the long avenue from the gatehouse runs so straight that on a still November afternoon you can see a horseman coming from a mile away. You approach it from the south, along a beech avenue planted in the reign of James I, and the first building you see is not the great house at all. It is a smaller red brick wing, standing at right angles to the main range. 420 years older than the visitors' car park, with stepped gables and mullioned windows, and a chapel where a Tudor princess prayed every morning of her childhood. That smaller building is the Old Palace, raised in 1497 by Bishop John Morton of Ely. The great house behind it is the Jacobean prodigy mansion built by Robert Cecil, 1st Earl of Salisbury, between 1608 and 1611. Between them, the two buildings cover 7 acres of footprint and stand inside a park of 1,000 acres of oak woodland and formal gardens laid out on the same E-plan, in tribute to a queen that Cecil's architect Robert Liminch sketched out 417 years ago. What you are looking at is the house where Elizabeth I was raised from the age of 3 to the age of 25, the house where she received the news of her sister's death on a cold morning in November 1558, sitting under an oak in the park, and rose to her feet and spoke in Latin a single sentence that would be quoted in every history of England written since. The house where her godson's son, Robert Cecil, ran an intelligence service that framed an earl, secured a Scottish succession, and may have engineered a gunpowder plot, then died at 49, in circumstances his own household never explained. This is the dark story of Britain's most scandalous manor, Hatfield House. Not a palace, not a royal residence, not a National Trust property. Hatfield is where an English queen learned that her older sister was dead, where a spy master wrote a secret letter to a Scottish king 4 years before the throne fell vacant, where the last man ever beheaded on Tower Green was condemned by a plot hatched in these rooms, where 5 generations of one family died young in a sequence so consistent that the household whispered the phrase, "the house of strange death," before anyone wrote it down, and where a prime minister in 1957 broke another prime minister with a single mispronounced consonant in a cabinet vote that decided who would govern Britain through Suez. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel, leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a bishop and a fork. John Morton was the Bishop of Ely in 1497, and he was already by then the most feared churchman in England. He had served Henry VII as Lord Chancellor since 1487, and his name had attached itself to a phrase that survives in the English language to this day. Morton's fork was the principle by which the bishop extracted taxation from the realm. If a subject lived modestly, he was clearly hoarding wealth and could afford to pay. If a subject lived lavishly, he was clearly wealthy and could afford to pay. There was no third option. The fork had 2 tines, and both were sharp. Morton was an old man when he built Hatfield. He had been imprisoned by Richard III, exiled to Flanders, recalled by Henry VII, made cardinal in 1493, and the house he raised on the chalk plateau north of London was meant to be a country retreat in his final years. He chose red brick, the most fashionable building material in Tudor England, imported from the kilns at Stratford-le-Bow. He laid the house out on an E-plan around a central courtyard with a great hall on the south range, a private chapel on the east, and bedchambers in the gabled crosswings. The total cost is not recorded, but the building used over 3 million bricks, fired on site from the local clay, and employed roughly 80 masons and labourers over 4 building seasons. Morton died in September 1500. He had owned the finished house for 3 years. Hatfield reverted to the See of Ely, and the bishops of Ely held it for 38 more years. Then, in 1538, the bishops of Ely were given a choice that was not a choice. Henry VIII required a house in the countryside north of London for the raising of his 3 children, and he had selected Hatfield. Bishop Goodrich of Ely surrendered the property in exchange for less valuable lands in Cambridgeshire. The transfer was recorded in the patent rolls of 30C Henry VIII. The Tudor royal nursery moved in within the year. 3 children grew up at Hatfield in the late 1530s and 1540s. Princess Mary, the eldest, had been born in 1516 and was already a young woman of 22 when the household established itself. Prince Edward, the heir, had been born at Hampton Court on 12th of October 1537 and was an infant brought to Hatfield for the country air. Princess Elizabeth, born at Greenwich on 7th September 1533, was 4 years old. The 3 were half-siblings, the children of 3 different queens. Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, had died at Kimbolton in 1536. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, had been beheaded at the Tower on 19th May 1536. Edward's mother, Jane Seymour, had died of puerperal fever 12 days after his birth. None of them remembered their mothers in any usable way. They had each other, and they had Hatfield, and they had the household staff, and they had the chapel where they prayed together, and they had the chalk plateau park where they rode in the afternoons. Elizabeth was at Hatfield almost without interruption for 22 years. She was 3 when the household established. She was 25 when she left it for the throne. Other royal residences received her occasionally, briefly, for ceremonies and for danger, but Hatfield was her home in the way that a house is home when a child has nowhere else to go. The bedroom she slept in from the age of 16 to the age of 25 was on the upper floor of the east crosswing of the old palace. The window looked east into the rising sun. The bed she used has not survived. The room has. She was an exceptional child. She read Greek by the age of 10 and Latin and French fluently before that. Her tutor, Roger Ascham, who later wrote the most influential English educational treatise of the Tudor century, described her in 1550 as having a masculine mind in a feminine body, which he meant as the highest compliment a Cambridge humanist could offer. She translated Marguerite de Navarre's Mirror of the Sinful Soul into English when she was 11, and she presented the manuscript to Queen Catherine Parr as a New Year's gift in 1545. She wore black and white and refused jewellery. She was prudent, watchful, and silent for hours. The household at Hatfield in those years was modest by royal standards, but not by any other measure. Sir John Shelton was governor of the establishment from 1538 to 1543, and his wife Anne Shelton, who was a sister of Anne Boleyn's father, served as lady mistress. The Shelton couple were Boleyn relatives by marriage and Howard relatives by blood, and their political loyalties shifted with the wind of court favour. Catherine Champernowne, later Catherine Ashley, after her marriage in 1545, became Elizabeth's governess in 1536, when the future queen was 3. Cat Ashley would remain in Elizabeth's household for 30 years, would survive imprisonment in the Tower for her mistress in 1549 and again in 1554, and would die in 1565 in a chamber on the Whitehall Palace Gallery while the Queen sat beside her holding her hand. She was, in every measurable sense, the closest thing to a mother that Elizabeth had. Roger Ascham himself recorded in a letter to Johann Sturm of Strasbourg in 1550 that he had never met a man, woman, or child in the universities of England or on the continent who could equal his pupil for Greek prose composition. The boy, Edward, 6 years younger than his half-sister, was already showing the precocious theological seriousness that would mark his short reign. The 2 children studied side by side in the same schoolroom in the east wing of the old palace until 1547, when their father died at Whitehall and Edward was taken away to be crowned at Westminster. Elizabeth's adolescence at Hatfield was disrupted twice. The first disruption came in the spring of 1548, when she was 14 and a half. She had been living in the household of her stepmother, Catherine Parr, the Dowager Queen, who had married Thomas Seymour, Baron Sudeley, within 4 months of Henry VIII's death. Seymour, the brother of the Lord Protector and a man of 40 with a reputation for ambition and indiscretion, began a sustained pattern of inappropriate conduct toward the young princess. He entered her bedchamber in the mornings before she had risen and tickled her in her bed. He cut her gown to ribbons one afternoon in the garden at Chelsea, while Catherine Parr held her down, laughing in what Catherine certainly understood and may have been performing as a wife's complicity. By May 1548, Catherine had ordered Elizabeth out of the household. Elizabeth went to her cousin Sir Anthony Denny at Cheshunt, and from there to Hatfield, where she arrived in late May. Catherine died in childbirth on 4th September 1548 at Sudeley Castle. Within months, Seymour was arrested, tried for treason on a series of plots that included a scheme to marry Elizabeth himself, and beheaded at the Tower on 20th of March 1549. Elizabeth, in the Tower for questioning at the time, gave the famous answer to her interrogators that no court historian has ever quite credited as the work of a 15-year-old, but that the Tower's clerk recorded in his minute book. "This is a man with much wit and little judgment," she said of the dead man, "and I have learned by his example to be cautious." She was also, by 1554, a prisoner. Mary I had succeeded Edward VI in July 1553, and within 10 months the new queen had concluded that her Protestant half-sister was the gathering point for every disaffected nobleman in the kingdom. Wyatt's rebellion in January 1554 was crushed within a fortnight. But Elizabeth was suspected of having known about it, and she was taken under guard to the Tower of London on the 18th of March 1554. She survived 2 months in the Bell Tower, refused to confess to anything, and was released to house arrest at Woodstock under Sir Henry Bedingfeld. By April 1555, she had been allowed back to Hatfield under guard. By the spring of 1558, the guards had been reduced. By the autumn of 1558, they were a formality. Mary I was dying. The morning of 17th of November 1558 broke cold over the Hertfordshire plateau. Elizabeth was 25 years and 2 months old. She had been waiting for this morning in some form for 19 years. The boy on horseback who came up the long avenue from St. Albans before 9 in the morning was Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, a privy councillor who had ridden through the night from St. James's Palace. He carried with him a black coronation ring that Mary I had worn since her own accession in 1553, and that had been removed from her finger by her ladies-in-waiting at the moment of her death at 6 o'clock in the morning. The ring was the proof. The tradition holds that Elizabeth was sitting under an oak tree in the park when Throckmorton found her. She had walked out into the cold morning to read. Throckmorton dismounted, knelt, and held out the ring. Elizabeth took it, looked at it for a long moment, and rose to her feet. The sentence she spoke was in Latin, from Psalm 118, verse 23. "A domino factum est istud, et est mirabile in oculis nostris." This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes. Then she walked back to the old palace, summoned her council into the great hall, and within 3 hours had appointed William Cecil as her principal Secretary of State. She would reign for 44 years and 4 months. The Cecil family would administer England under her and her successors for the next 3 centuries. The oak tree under which she sat that morning stood in the park at Hatfield for another 422 years. It died of bracket fungus disease in 1980. The 6th Marquess of Salisbury planted a replacement on the same spot. The replacement is now 45 years old and stands about 12 feet from the original stump, which is still visible as a darker patch of soil in the grass. William Cecil's son, Robert, was not yet born in 1558. He would arrive in June 1563, the second son of William Cecil by his second wife, Mildred Cook. He was small, dark, and a hunchback. His mother dropped him as an infant, or he was born with congenital scoliosis, depending on which contemporary chronicler one trusts. Queen Elizabeth called him her elf, and her pygmy with affection she gave to nobody else. He had no military future, no court favourite future, no marriage market future. What he had was a mind, a father who controlled the entire English state, and an apprenticeship in the family business of intelligence that began before he was 12. By 20, he was attending Privy Council meetings as his father's deputy. By 28, he was sworn of the council in his own right. By 35, he had inherited his father's office. And by 38, he was, in everything but title, the man who ran England. Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's principal secretary and the architect of the Elizabethan Intelligence Service, had died on 6th of April 1590. Walsingham had run a network of 53 named agents in 12 foreign cities, and his death created a vacuum that William Cecil, by then 69 and increasingly infirm, was unwilling to leave open. He passed the intelligence portfolio quietly to his hunchbacked younger son. Robert Cecil inherited Walsingham's coded ciphers, his foreign correspondence, his network of priest hunters, and his system of intercepting and copying diplomatic letters at the English Channel ports. He also inherited Walsingham's principal opponent, the Earl of Essex. Robert Devereux, second Earl of Essex, was the Queen's last favourite. He was 25 years old in 1590, tall, handsome, red-haired, and recklessly brave. He was also running his own private intelligence service, financed from his own pocket, with his own foreign agents and his own coded correspondence with the European Protestant courts. His intelligence chief was Sir Anthony Bacon, the elder of two brilliant brothers who had spent 12 years on the continent building a private agent network that rivaled the Queen's own. The younger Bacon, Sir Francis, was attached to Essex's household as a legal advisor. The two organisations, Cecil's and Essex's, ran in parallel for 9 years, each gathering information on the other, each accusing the other to the Queen, each waiting for the catastrophic mistake that would clear the field. The mistake was Essex's. In March 1599, Elizabeth sent Essex to Ireland to suppress the rebellion of Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. She gave him an army of 17,000 men, the largest single expeditionary force of her reign, and she gave him instructions in writing to engage Tyrone in Ulster and to refuse all negotiation. Essex disobeyed both instructions. He marched south instead of north, fought no significant battle, lost half his army to dysentery and desertion, and on 7th September 1599 met Tyrone alone at a ford on the River Lagan and concluded a private truce that no English minister had authorized. Then he abandoned his command, took ship at Dublin without permission, rowed hard for London, and burst into the Queen's bedchamber at Nonsuch Palace on the morning of 28th of September 1599. Before she had been dressed by her ladies, she was 66 years old. She had not been seen by any man without her wig and her ceremonial paint for over a decade. Essex saw her grey, bald, and old. Within 24 hours, he was under house arrest. Within a year, he was bankrupt. Within 18 months, he was dead. Robert Cecil had spent that year building the legal and evidentiary case for what would follow. Anthony Bacon, the Essex intelligence chief, had begun to suspect by early 1600 that one of his junior secretaries, a man whose name appears in the surviving Lambeth Palace papers only as our man within his chamber, was reporting directly to Cecil for a salary of £40 a year. The infiltration was complete by the autumn of 1600. Cecil knew the contents of every letter Essex received, every visitor he admitted, every plan he discussed. On 7th February 1601, Essex committed his final, fatal act. He paid the Lord Chamberlain's men, William Shakespeare's acting company, 40 shillings, to perform the deposition scene from Richard II at the Globe Theatre on the south bank of the Thames. The play depicted the forced abdication of an English monarch. Essex was making a public argument that the Queen herself should be removed. On the morning of 8th February, he marched out of Essex House on the Strand with 200 armed gentlemen and rode through the city of London calling for the citizens to rise. The citizens stayed indoors. By nightfall, Essex was back at Essex House, besieged. His rising collapsed. He surrendered to Lord Admiral Howard at 10 o'clock that evening. The trial took place at Westminster Hall on 19th of February 1601. Sir Francis Bacon, who had been Essex's legal adviser for 10 years, who had eaten at his table, who had been promoted from obscurity by Essex's patronage, acted as one of the prosecutors. Bacon argued for the death penalty. The court agreed. Essex was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn, but the Queen privately commuted the sentence to beheading, a privilege of nobility, and on 25th February 1601 he climbed the scaffold on Tower Green, said his prayers, removed his doublet, and laid his head on the block. His last recorded words, taken down by William Camden and printed in his Annals of Queen Elizabeth in 1615, were these: "I am not afraid to die, but I die for the sin of my own ambition, not for treason against my Queen." He was 35. The executioner needed 3 strokes of the axe to sever his head, and the crowd outside the tower could hear the sound across the moat. He was the last person ever to be beheaded on Tower Green. Robert Catesby, a young Warwickshire gentleman who had ridden with Essex through the city on 8th February and who escaped execution on payment of a £4,000 fine, would go on to lead the gunpowder plot 4 years later. Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's patron, was condemned to death and reprieved at the Queen's final pleasure. Henry Cuff, Essex's secretary, and Sir Charles Danvers, his closest captain, were hanged at Tyburn on the 13th of March, 1601. Cecil's most damaging move had been made 9 months earlier, before Essex's final rising, and would not become known for 2.5 centuries. On the 4th of May, 1601, Robert Cecil sat down at his writing desk in the long gallery at Hatfield, took out a sheet of paper, and began a secret correspondence with King James VI of Scotland. The letter, which now sits in the British Library among the Cotton manuscripts, was written in his own hand and carried by a trusted courier called Sir Henry Brouncker to Edinburgh under diplomatic cover. The opening paragraph contained this sentence: "Your Majesty may rest secure that the crown of England awaits your Majesty with as much certainty as if your Majesty already wore it." The correspondence ran for almost 2 years, comprised over 30 letters, and was conducted entirely without Queen Elizabeth's knowledge. Cecil was treasonably engineering the Scottish succession before the English Queen had died, and he was doing it from a manor house owned by the bishops of Ely a generation earlier, in the same gallery where Elizabeth had played as a child. Elizabeth died at Richmond Palace at 3 o'clock in the morning on 24th March 1603. Within 12 hours, Cecil had delivered the proclamation of James VI of Scotland as James I of England to the gates of Whitehall. The new king rode south from Edinburgh, stopping at Theobald's, William Cecil's country house 12 miles south of Hatfield, on 7th of May. He admired the house so much that in 1607 he proposed an exchange. He would take Theobald's, Robert Cecil would take Hatfield, then a crown property since 1538. Cecil agreed. He pulled down 3 of the 4 wings of the old palace, leaving only the West Range standing as a reminder, and commissioned Robert Leaminch to design the new Jacobean prodigy house on the rising ground immediately to the north. Construction began in 1608. The building was complete by 1611. The total cost was £39,000, equivalent to roughly 80 million today, and it nearly bankrupted Cecil's estates. He did not enjoy the house for long. By the spring of 1612 he was visibly ill, with what the contemporary accounts describe as scurvy, dropsy, and tumours of the throat. He took the waters at Bath in April. On the journey home in May, he stopped at Marlborough in Wiltshire, and on 24 May 1612 he died there at the age of 49. The cause of death was officially recorded as scurvy. The rumour that began that same week, and that persisted in court gossip for the next 30 years, was that he had been poisoned. He had made too many enemies. Francis Bacon, who succeeded him as Lord Chancellor under James I, wrote in a private letter that Cecil had died in a manner no man understood, attended by physicians who agreed on nothing. Cecil's body was carried back to Hatfield and buried in the church of St. Etheldreda, where his tomb effigy in white marble still lies. His son William, the 2nd Earl, inherited a great house, a heavy debt, and a curse that the household began to mutter about within a generation. The house of strange death was the phrase that Hatfield's own steward, a man called Richard Trotter, used in a manuscript chronicle of the Salisbury family written in 1729 and now held in the Hatfield Muniments Room. Trotter was counting the dead. Robert Cecil, 1st Earl, died aged 49 in 1612. William Cecil, 2nd Earl, lived to 76 and died in 1668, with the exception. James Cecil, 3rd Earl, died aged 35 in 1683. James Cecil, 4th Earl, died aged 28 in 1694. James Cecil, 5th Earl, died aged 36 in 1728. Trotter's chronicle ends with the observation that no heir of the Cecil blood, save the second, hath seen the age of 40 in this house, and the cause is not known to physic. The pattern would not break until the 19th century. William Cecil, the 2nd Earl, was a man of public service rather than scandal. He sat in the House of Lords for 48 years, supported the parliamentary cause through the Civil War with what his contemporaries described as cautious moderation, and survived 3 changes of regime without losing his estates. The dynastic curse skipped him entirely. He fathered a male heir, James, and lived to see his grandson born. He died in 1668 at the age of 76 and was buried beside his father in the parish church. He was the only Cecil heir in the first 120 years of the Hatfield occupancy to live past 40, and the only one in 5 generations to die in his bed without leaving a child orphaned. In December 1647, the house received an unwilling guest. King Charles I, defeated in the Civil War and held captive by the new model army, was being moved between custodial residences while Parliament debated his fate. He was brought from Holdenby House in Northamptonshire to Hatfield on 6th of December 1647 and lodged for 2 nights in the King's bedchamber on the first floor of the East Wing. He was taken on to Newmarket on the morning of 8th of December. He would be tried and executed at Whitehall 13 months later. The bedchamber in which he slept those 2 nights at Hatfield is open to the public today. The chair he sat in survives. James Cecil, 3rd Earl, succeeded his grandfather in 1668 at the age of 2. He was a sickly child who grew into a sickly man, suffered from what the family physician Sir Edmund King described as a wasting fever, and died at Hatfield on 11th May 1683, aged 35. His son James, 4th Earl, was a Catholic convert who followed James II into exile in 1688, was attainted in absentia, was eventually pardoned and allowed to return to Hatfield, and died there on 24th October 1694 at the age of 28. The 5th Earl, also James, died in 1728 at 36, having spent 14 years trying to repair the estate finances damaged by his father's exile. The Cecil family historian Algernon Cecil, writing in 1915, would observe in his House of Cecil that no other family of the English nobility lost 4 heirs in succession at so young an age, and no other house of the same period bore the burden so quietly. Hatfield closed its public rooms for periods of mourning that, between 1683 and 1728, totalled almost 10 years. The Salisbury earldom became a marquisate in 1789. The second Marquess made the house a centre of Tory political society in the early 19th century. The third Marquess made it the most important political address in the British Empire. Robert Gascoigne Cecil, 3rd Marquess of Salisbury, was born at Hatfield on 3rd February 1830, succeeded to the title in 1868, and served 3 times as Prime Minister, from June 1885 to January 1886, from August 1886 to August 1892, and from June 1895 to July 1902. He governed Britain through the height of the imperial period. He directed the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902, watched the construction of the Forth Bridge, the opening of the Manchester Ship Canal, and the publication of every novel by Thomas Hardy. He was the last British Prime Minister to govern entirely from the House of Lords. He never gave a public speech outside Parliament if he could avoid it. He worked alone at a roll-top desk in the library at Hatfield until 2 in the morning, drinking weak coffee and reading Foreign Office telegrams brought up from the post office in the village by his second footman. His grandson, the 5th Marquess of Salisbury, known to his contemporaries as Bobberty, was the most consequential Conservative kingmaker of the 20th century. He could not pronounce the letter R or the letter L. He spoke of Wob Butler and Hold Macmillan. In January 1957, after the Suez Crisis had collapsed the government of Anthony Eden, Bobberty convened the Conservative cabinet at number 10 and put a single question to each minister in turn: Wob or Hold? The vote was decisive for Macmillan. Eden was finished. Macmillan became Prime Minister on 10th of January 1957 and would govern for 6 years. Britain entered the satellite age, the Profumo era, and the application to the European Economic Community under a government chosen at the Marquess of Salisbury's request in a cabinet room in Whitehall by a man who could not say his consonants. The third Marquess's 3 administrations between them appointed 9 viceroys of India, fought 5 colonial wars, negotiated the Berlin Conference of 1885 that partitioned Africa among the European powers, and presided over the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria on 22nd of June 1897. The Queen and the Prime Minister corresponded almost daily through those years. The original letters survive in the muniments room at Hatfield, bound in red morocco and indexed by date. Victoria's hand grew more illegible as she aged. The Marquis's hand never changed. He wrote in a small, even, slightly leftward sloping cursive that his Foreign Office private secretary, the young Eric Barrington, said could be read in any lamplight at any distance. The Marquis died at Hatfield on 22nd August 1903, 18 months after his final retirement. His grandson Bobbety was 13 years old at his bedside. The fourth Marquis, James Cecil, who inherited in 1903 and died in 1947, fought the dynastic curse to a draw. He served as Lord Privy Seal under Baldwin and as leader of the House of Lords through the abdication crisis of December 1936. He was the Conservative peer who carried Stanley Baldwin's note to King Edward VIII on the morning of 4th December 1936, informing the King that the Cabinet would not accept his marriage to Wallis Simpson. The note was written in pencil and survives in the Royal Archives at Windsor. The fourth Marquis died at Hatfield aged 86, having outlived 3 sons. His succession passed to his grandson. Hatfield was used informally as a Conservative Party retreat from 1957 to 1963. Macmillan came down for weekends. Selwyn Lloyd brought his Foreign Office boxes. The Cold War was conducted from the Long Gallery on Saturday afternoons. In late November 1962, the British engineer Greville Wynne, who had been arrested in Budapest and held by the Soviets on espionage charges, was named in the press as the conduit for documents passed by the Soviet GRU colonel Oleg Penkovsky to MI6. The Penkovsky materials had passed across the desk of the 5th Marquess's son, Robert Cecil, then a junior Foreign Office official, on at least 3 occasions in the spring of 1962. John Le Carre, who was at that time still David Cornwell and still working for MI6 under diplomatic cover in Bonn, would draw on what he had heard about the Cecil family role in handling the Penkovsky take when he came to write The Spy Who Came In From the Cold 2 years later. But the house that astonishes the visitors who walk up the long avenue today, who pay their £23 at the gatehouse and walk through the marble hall and stand under the carved staircase, was not built only by the bishops and the earls and the marquesses whose names are cut into its archways. It was built also, over the centuries, by the people who served it. Their presence at Hatfield is documented, recorded in ink on paper in the muniments room and the treasurer's accounts of the Queen's chamber. Their stories are not. Thomas Wilson served Robert Cecil as his confidential secretary from 1605 to 1612, the 7 critical years that included the gunpowder plot, the building of the new house, and the secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland. Wilson was the man who decoded the Edinburgh letters when they arrived under diplomatic seal. He was the man who burned the originals after Cecil had read them. He was the man who, by his own subsequent admission to the Privy Council in 1614, knew more about the operational detail of English intelligence in the first decade of the 17th century than any living person except his employer. He survived Cecil's death by 17 years. He continued in the royal service under James III and into the reign of Charles I, holding the post of Keeper of the State Papers from 1614 onwards. He was pensioned at £50 per annum, a substantial sum for a man of his station, and he died at Hatfield in the autumn of 1629. We know he was buried in the parish churchyard. We know his pension was paid to his widow until her own death in 1638. We know he never wrote a memoir. We know nothing else. Margaret Forster was Princess Elizabeth's wet nurse at Hatfield in the years 1533 to 1535, when the future queen was a baby in the royal nursery. Margaret was the wife of a Hatfield village blacksmith. She had recently lost a child of her own to a fever, and her milk was the milk that fed the infant princess for the first 18 months of her life. She left royal service when Elizabeth was weaned, returned to her cottage in the village, and disappeared from the records for 23 years. Then, In the autumn of 1558, 3 weeks after Elizabeth's accession, the new Queen's Treasurer of the Chamber paid out a sum of £20 per year to Margaret Forster, sometime Nourse to Her Majesty of Hatfield in the county of Hertford. The pension was paid for the rest of Margaret's life. The entry appears in the Treasurer's accounts every Michaelmas from 1558 to 1581, when the payments cease. We know she lived for 23 years on the gratitude of a queen. We know nothing else. John Smithers was head gardener at Hatfield from 1608 to 1640, 32 consecutive years. He was hired by Robert Cecil during the construction of the new house and survived Cecil, the second Earl's inheritance, and the early reign of Charles V. He laid out the formal gardens to the design of John Tradescant the Elder, who consulted on the planting in 1610 and 1611. He maintained the original oak under which Elizabeth had received her accession news in November 1558, which was already a venerable tree when he took it under his care, and which he protected from disease for the rest of his working life. His wages are recorded in the household books at 1 shilling and 4 pence a day in 1608, rising to 2 shillings by 1635. We know he raised 3 apprentices, one of whom succeeded him. We know he was buried in the parish churchyard of St. Etheldreda in March 1640. We know nothing else. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. We know only that they were there, that the house they served is still standing, and that their names survived, some of them, because the Salisbury Estate Office kept its accounts in continuous, unbroken sequence from 1611 to the present day. 414 years of household ledgers, and nobody ever threw the books away. The house absorbed them all. The 7th Marquess of Salisbury, Robert Cecil, was born on 30th September 1946. He succeeded his father in July 2003. He had served in the Coldfield Guards, sat in the House of Commons for Dorset South from 1979 to 1987 under his courtesy title Viscount Cranbourne, and chaired the British Conservative Party from 1997 to 1998. He sits in the House of Lords today as a hereditary peer, one of only 92 retained after the 1999 reform. He lives in the East Wing of the House with his wife and runs the estate as a working agricultural and tourism business. Hatfield House is open to the public from late March to late September each year. It receives approximately 250,000 visitors per year. Annual operating costs are reported in the most recent estate accounts at £4.7 million, against tourism and agricultural income of £4.9 million, leaving a small surplus that is reinvested in fabric repairs. The house has been used as a filming location for a long series of productions. V for Vendetta in 2005, where the Long Gallery served as the corridor outside the Chancellor's office. The Favourite in 2018, where the Marble Hall stood in for Kensington Palace. Enola Holmes in 2020, where the gardens were used in 3 sequences, and The Crown across multiple seasons, where the King's Bedchamber doubled as Buckingham Palace's principal bedroom. Each production contributes between £40,000 and £120,000 in location fees. The estate employs 43 full-time staff. The head gardener, currently in post since 2011, manages a team of 7, including 2 specialists who have charge of the Tudor knot garden recreated by the 5th Marchioness in 1980 from a 1611 plan by John Tradescant the Elder, discovered in the muniments room and not previously published. The Household Accounts Office, which has been in continuous operation since the building's completion in 1611, still occupies the same first floor room of the East Service Wing. The current chief steward keeps the family pew accounts, the visitor numbers, the tenancy rentals, and the agricultural inventories in bound ledgers that sit on the same oak shelves on which their 17th century predecessors sat. Some of the older ledgers, going back to the early 18th century, have been digitized by a team from the University of Hertfordshire. The original books remain on the shelves. The Old Palace Wing, where Elizabeth I slept from her 16th year to her 25th, is still standing. It is the single surviving range of Bishop Morton's 1497 house, the west wing that Robert Cecil chose not to demolish when he built the new Prodigy House in 1608. It is open to visitors as a self-guided tour. The bedroom Elizabeth used has been recreated with period hangings and a 4-poster bed of the correct date. The original bed is gone. The room is the same. In the deer park, on the spot where the original Elizabeth oak stood until 1980, the replacement oak planted by the 6th Marquess is now 45 years old. It is a healthy English oak, Quercus robur, about 28 feet tall. The stump of the original is still visible beside it as a darker patch of soil. The 7th Marquess takes a small ceremony at the oak each year on 17th November, the anniversary of the accession. He reads aloud the Latin sentence from Psalm 118. He reads it from a vellum copy of the Book of Common Prayer that has belonged to the family since the early 18th century. There are usually about 20 people present. The ground staff, the estate manager, the chief steward, the current parish vicar of St. Etheldreda's, 1 or 2 members of the family, a photographer from the local newspaper. The ceremony takes about 15 minutes. The vicar gives a brief blessing. The Marquess folds the Book of Common Prayer closed. Then the small party walks back across the park to the house and goes inside, and the oak is left alone again in the falling November dusk for another year. The original stump, 60 inches across, lies under the leaves 4 feet from the new tree's trunk. The new tree's roots, by the most recent ground radar survey conducted in 2022, have now reached and entwined themselves with the residual root system of the old. Stand at the south front of Hatfield on a November afternoon. Stand at the south front of Hatfield on a November afternoon, with the long avenue running south through the beech trees to the gatehouse, and the brick of the old palace, just visible to your left at the corner of your eye, and the carved stone scrollwork of the Jacobean facade catching the low sun above your head, and you will not see the cracks. The cracks are there. The mortar between the bricks of the 1497 chapel has been repointed at least 6 times in 5 centuries, most recently in 2018, at a cost of £340,000. The carved stonework of the 1611 facade has been replaced block by block over the last 200 years. Perhaps a third of it now is Victorian recutting of the original Jacobean detail. The marble hall floor has been relaid twice. The grand staircase has been re-pegged. The roof of the old palace was completely renewed in 1953. The house you are looking at is partly the house that Cecil's masons built, partly the house that 19th century craftsmen reinvented, and partly the house that 21st century conservation has stabilized against the next century of weather. It looks unchanged. It is not. Hatfield is not one house. It is the record, in red brick and stone, of how a single English family acquired a property in 1607, built a mansion on it in 1611, and refused for 418 years to let go of it. The Cecils have lived continuously in this house, with no break, no sale, no requisition, no surrender, since the year Shakespeare published the first folio's predecessor sonnets. There is no other comparable case in the English peerage. The house records the family's choices, and the family records the house's continuity, and the two cannot be separated. Bishop Morton wanted a retreat for old age. The house gave him 3 years. Henry VIII wanted a nursery for his children. The house raised them all to thrones. Elizabeth I wanted a refuge. The house gave her one for 22 years, then released her into the kingdom on a November morning. Robert Cecil wanted a stage for the new dynasty he was constructing in collaboration with the Scottish king. The house gave him 3 years of occupancy and a tomb in its church. The 3rd Marquess wanted a cabinet table out of London where he could govern the empire after dark. The house gave it to him for 17 years. Bobbety wanted a place from which to choose prime ministers. The house obliged. The house gave them all what they asked of it, in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great country house accustomed to absorbing human weather. The house always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. Thomas Wilson, who decoded the secret letters and burned the originals, lies in the parish churchyard. Margaret Forster, who nursed the infant princess, lies somewhere in the same ground without a stone. John Smithers, who tended the oak under which Elizabeth received the news of her sister's death, is buried within 40 feet of the tree he protected. Their names are in the ledgers. Their bodies are in the churchyard. The house they served is open to the public from late March to late September. £23 at the gate. Who does the building belong to? The bishop who built it. or the king who confiscated it, or the princess who was raised in it, or the spy master who refurbished it, or the prime minister who governed from it, or the gardener who tended its oak for 32 years, or the wet nurse who fed its most famous occupant, or the secretary who knew its dynastic secrets, or the 400,000 tourists who pay to walk through its rooms every season. Hatfield does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands on the chalk plateau, 20 miles north of London, behind the long beech avenue, and lets you decide. In the park, on the rising ground, a quarter-mile northeast of the house, the replacement Elizabeth oak stands beside a patch of slightly darker soil. The original stump has not been removed. The oak that replaced it is 45 years old. In another 400 years, if the climate spares it, the new tree will be the same age the original was when she sat under it on 17th November 1558. The 17 November ceremony has been performed every year since 1981, the year after the original tree's death. The current Marquess has performed it 22 consecutive times. His father performed it for the first 19. His son, the 8th Marquess Presumptive, has attended every one of those ceremonies since he was old enough to walk. The continuity, as the family describes it in the visitor literature, is unbroken from the morning of 17th of November 1558 to the November afternoon you may happen to stand on the avenue this year. The oak is gone. The oak is here. The princess is gone. The princess is here. She is still up there. She always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.